Hi, I'm Aggie Mutuma. I run an organization called Mahogany Inclusion Partners. As the name suggests, we support organizations on their inclusion journeys. I am the author of the CIPD guide on how to talk about race at work. The importance of inclusion and the awareness of race disparities in the workplace and in society isn't new. As a society, we don't tend to talk about these topics, do we? We tend to talk about things that are less contentious, and we haven't really talked about race in the way that we have over the last 18 months since the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, which highlighted for us and for many of us the racial disparities which still exist today in society and in the workplace. We heard new topics and new language, didn't we, around fragility and anti-Black racism, maybe allyship and white advantage, things that we hadn't really talked about or heard about before. We heard about the pain of the Black community, and we heard a lot of these things, and maybe we felt feelings of guilt, confusion, sadness, questions such as, how can I be part of the problem? Questions such as, how has this been happening for so long without me being aware, without us being aware? Conversations started happening in the workplace about these topics. And for a lot of us, they were difficult, they were uncomfortable, maybe at times divisive. The relationship, the conversation, because of our history with race, it sometimes invokes pain, it invokes guilt, like we said, it invokes lots of questions, discomfort and feelings of injustice, which is why it's sometimes really tough to talk about, which is why sometimes we don't have the conversation. But as we know, with any change, for it to start, for it to happen, it starts with a conversation, doesn't it? It starts with sharing perspectives. It starts with sharing where we agree and how we can move things forward. And the same applies to this conversation. If we handle it sensitively, conversations around race, around anything, around racism can be liberating. They can connect us as people. We can share our experiences, and we can also share where we agree and how we can move things forward and make this hopefully a conversation of the past. Talking about it can help us work towards a fair and equal society together. In writing the CIPD guide around having conversations around race, the aim was to help people, professionals, to enable these conversations to happen in the workplace, to start these conversations around how different workplaces can look at their own organizations, how these concepts, how these theories, how racism and anti-racism works in their own context, and then move things forward. To help connect colleagues, to help develop strategies and initiatives to deal with racism and anti-racism in the workplace. So what we want to do now, and what I'd love to do now, is to give you some highlights of that guide so that you can start thinking about it. You can maybe feel more comfortable to have these conversations and hopefully start working towards eradicating racism in your workplace and around you, because we all have a part to play. And one of the things we can definitely start to do is talk about it with the aim to eradicate it. So as we think about having the conversation around race, it's really important to sort of chunk it up into 3 areas, I would suggest. The first area that I'll focus on is before you start the conversation. We'll then focus on during the conversation, and then we'll talk about what you can do and think about after the conversation. So starting with before the conversation. It's really important that you prepare for the conversation. And you can do this if you're not familiar through training courses, which most organizations will organize. So feel free to speak to your HR team and your line managers. Sharing articles, reading articles, perhaps webinars, and maybe looking at existing information that you have in your organization. And the reason why that's important, it's around really understanding language for starters, because that's quite important. So check Google, check, like we said, the articles and webinars, podcasts, etc., because language can be quite a tricky one, can't it? It changes, you're not sure what's right, what's not right. But do a bit of research yourself and understand what the current language is. And then also what I would suggest also around language is listen to the person in front of you. Language is a very personal thing. There are lots of reasons why people may like a certain term, may not like a certain term. So while I say look into it yourself and self-educate, also listen to the person in front of you. If they say, no, I don't like that term, then take that on board. So absolutely, before you have the conversations, have a bit of understanding around language. Also consider your own mindset as well. It's better to go into these conversations with an open growth mindset as opposed to a closed one. When we have different conversations, there's lots of ways you can have a conversation, aren't there? You can debate, which is about, you're right, I'm wrong, I'm going to prove you wrong, which is one way of conversating. You can have a conversation which is about trying to convince someone of something, or you can have a conversation which is about trying to understand the other person. When it comes to these conversations, I definitely invite you to have that in the place where you're trying to understand the other person. Have conversations around sharing perspectives and trying to understand what's going on for the other person. Especially with this topic, if you stick to that side where you're trying to understand, it's definitely going to be more fruitful for you and more helpful for you as well. And also think about not coming in with your own judgments. So suspend your judgments, have that active listening, things that I know you know already, but definitely worth a reminder. I would also suggest if you're having these conversations in the workplace, or when you're having these conversations in the workplace, speak to your HR team, maybe your manager, your L&D team, around having some skilled facilitators who can help you to have these conversations as well. Also, there are lots of tools and resources and advice as well available on the Anti-Racism Hub for the CIPD. Have a look at that. This guide is there too, the How to Talk About Race at Work, but there are many other things around language and things like that can support you in that as well. So definitely do your homework. Do your homework beforehand and check up, look up what you can. Then in the middle of the conversations, as we said, it's about being open, it's about being honest, it's about trying to understand the other person and listening without that judgment as well. We all bring our own perspectives to conversations, don't we, based on what we've experienced, based on what we felt in the past, based on maybe what our parents have told us or we've seen around us. Everybody has their own different perspectives. When it comes to a conversation about race, look at where you are and what your perspective is. If you are a person of color, you're probably going to have more experience about what it feels like to feel racism on a constant basis, on a frequent basis in different areas of your life than if you are a white person. So bearing that in mind is really, really important. I often use the example of myself when I think about conversations around the LGBTQ plus experience as an example. I go into that conversation knowing that I'm here to learn. I'm here to understand other people's perspectives. I'm here to sort of broaden my own knowledge of other people's experiences. I wouldn't necessarily go in there with, this is what I think, or this is my view, because I know I haven't experienced many things in that context. So I encourage everyone, when we're thinking about a conversation with race, to also bear that in mind. It's also important to ensure that the conversation, when you're having it, is a safe space for all parties involved. And what we mean by that is that a safe space is a place where there is no judgment. We're not here to judge each other. We're here to understand each other. We're not here to dismiss people's experiences. We're not going to say things such as, maybe they didn't mean it, or maybe it's not racism, or maybe you're just being sensitive. It's not about minimizing the person's experience or trying to put our own thoughts on it. It's about understanding and hearing it. It's about creating a space where it's safe to really talk about what you're feeling, what you're thinking, and get that understanding. So it's definitely around everyone really giving each other space to share, but also not having that judgment piece as well. Where we're thinking about having these conversations as well, I think one word I would ask you to have at the forefront of your mind is one of my favorite words in general anyway, is compassion. And I would say compassion for the person you're speaking to, absolutely, because as a fellow human who has feelings, emotions, thoughts, experiences, pain, hurt, all these things, just as you do. So you're there as fellow human beings. So compassion is really important. And I'd say compassion for yourself as well. It's likely that you'll get things wrong. And that's okay. That is okay because, we're all learning and it's a journey. So definitely have compassion for yourself. I think the important thing is that if you do get things wrong, I'll probably say when, because most of us will at some point in time, when you do get things wrong, you take the feedback if someone gives it to you and you understand that, but equally you just sort of think, right, I'll do better next time. So have compassion for yourself as well. And again, depending on the conversation you're having and when you're having it and how you're having it, some key things to consider, confidentiality. I'm sure I don't need to say it, but I'll say it anyway. Confidentiality is really important. If someone opens up to you, or I'll say when, again, because I'm sure they will, when they open up to you and share these, tough conversations or tough experiences, it's really important that that conversation stays between you or between the remit of the conversation you're having. So that's definitely something that's really, really important. As we said, we've got different perspectives, so really acknowledge that. And then also the fear piece. Very often we lose sight of the fact that the conversation is uncomfortable and difficult for, everybody involved in the conversation. For white people, it's definitely difficult in that this is quite new, this piece around privilege, and you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem and all these things. So it must feel quite difficult to be in that space. Equally, for people of color, it's also difficult to have the conversation. There is a misconception that, people of color like talking about racism. That really isn't the case for most people. The conversation around shared experience comes with pain, it comes with upset, it comes with trauma, it comes with all these things. So the conversation is difficult for all parties. And I know that for white people and for Black people, there are thoughts around, will I get it wrong? Will they see what I'm saying as combative maybe? Will I offend someone? So it's really important to acknowledge that that's happening on both sides. So let's acknowledge that, acknowledge the fear, acknowledge their discomfort. And like I said, be compassionate to each other. This is also about when we're talking, using I statements. So rather than speaking on behalf of other people, I feel, I would like to understand, or help me understand conversations like that. And also definitely understand that we all have learning. It's a long journey. It's a beautiful thing that we're taking it. It's a beautiful thing that we're considering taking it at least, but it is a journey. And also, I would say in these conversations, definitely seek shared meaning. For all of us, a lot of us have shared values around justice and fairness and doing right and doing good in the world. So when we might find the conversation getting a bit difficult, or we might find ourselves a bit stuck, let's try to get back to that place of shared meaning. So I think that's probably enough for now around, the actual conversations and things to think about as well. But I think if you're considering potential questions or discussions, I'm sure you have questions already that you have in your mind or things that you'd like to understand more. But, I would suggest, and I'm only going to give you one in this context, I would suggest, a simple question such as, how are you? Goes a long way. I've seen something on the news, or I've heard this, or I've seen this happening. How are you? It's a beautiful way to start the conversation. So I'd suggest maybe we you start the conversation there. Suggestion for you. And then thinking about things that may help the conversation, some terminology you may have heard recently that is quite new. I'll give you some hints and tips around what that might mean and what that means that can hopefully set you off so you can have a bit of an understanding around those. So some terms that we've had lots of questions around what do they mean? What is that? So anti-Black racism. Anti-Black racism is the specific exclusion and prejudice against people visibly or perceived to be of African descent. So, we'd call them, Black people, people like me, people like myself. So that's what anti-Black racism is. And a lot of people focus on anti-Black racism because that tends to be, if you look at the data, if you look at the lived experience, if you look at the outcomes around health, education, employment, that tends to be where the most disadvantage is. And the view is, if you focus on the place where the racism is the worst, hopefully it'll have a halo effect on the rest. So that's anti-Black racism. Then we have non-racist versus anti-racist. Another question that comes up. I have a lot of leaders and individuals asking, what is anti-racism? Why is it not okay just to not be racist? So non-racist behavior is not actively engaging in behavior that is racist. It is also not stopping racism. So an example of a non-racist behavior is hearing a joke, a racist joke, and saying nothing. So you don't actively engage, but you say nothing. But the concern that people have sometimes with just not being racist or saying nothing is the person who's told that joke doesn't know maybe that they've said something hurtful. They don't know that maybe that is unhelpful. So therefore, they might go and do it again. And they probably will go do it again because no one said, actually, have you thought about how that might feel if you heard that? An anti-racist, however, would hear that joke and would have that conversation around, have you thought about how that sounds? Have you thought about how somebody might feel if they heard that? Actually, that joke isn't helpful. Actually, that joke is hurtful. Because in being anti-racist in that example, the likelihood of that person doing it again is reduced. So therefore, your action is diminishing racism. So that's the difference. And that's why people sort of say it's better to be anti-racist, or we'd prefer people to be anti-racist rather than non. Non-racist allows racism to continue and actually allows it to grow. Anti-racist does something to hopefully diminish racism. There is a bite-sized video called Non-Racist versus Anti-Racist. Have a look at that because I'll explain that in a bit more detail for you. Then we have white privilege / white advantage. So some call it advantage, most call it privilege actually. And this is something that a lot of people have difficulty with because they feel as though, I've had a tough life too. How can I possibly have privilege? I'm happy to explain that to you. So privilege in this context is not necessarily about being born with a silver spoon in your mouth. It's about the absence of discrimination by virtue of part of your identity. An example I'll give you is of myself. I can give you two examples, actually. You can probably see that I'm a Christian. Well, maybe not, but I am a Christian. I've got a cross on, but I am a Christian. So in the UK, I have the privilege of being a Christian in that Christmas, Easter, days that are huge in my faith, I'm off. Most people are off. I can spend time with my family. I don't have to think about getting time off work. If I was of a different faith, I would have to think about getting time off for Diwali, maybe Ramadan, maybe Hanukkah, maybe it's different. So there's privilege in that respect. Also, I am not a wheelchair user, so I have a privilege there in that I can go to the train station, run up the stairs to a different platform, get on the train without thinking about it. If I was a wheelchair user, I would have to think about calling ahead to see if I can get through onto the platform's step-free access. I'd need to probably get someone potentially to have a ramp waiting for me to get on and off the train. So again, two examples of privilege that I have as a Christian and not a wheelchair user. So white privilege is the same concept. It's the absence of discrimination by virtue of the color of your skin. It's the absence of overt or covert discrimination by virtue of the color of your skin. And I think as I sort of draw to an end of this video, I would like to say, end where I began, which is it's important to have the conversation. For change to happen, for us to move forward, for us to eradicate racism, for us to understand it first, we need to have these conversations. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, there is fear. Yes, we don't want to offend. But if we can consider some of these principles we talked about in this video, if we can consider getting that training from our team, from our HR teams, definitely the CIPD Anti-Racism Hub has a lot on there. We can definitely give ourselves a level of comfort so we can have these conversations and start seeing how we as individuals can start to eradicate racism. As we said before, we all have a part to play. and I hope that we choose to play a part where we eradicate racism. Thank you.